So thanks everybody for being here. My name is Ryan Owens. I am the director of the Institute for Governance and Civics. I am very happy to have you here with us this evening. So the first thing I want to do, of course, is just thank our fantastic staff who worked on this. Leela Siegel, Katie O'Ryan, Savannah, Grant, everybody, thank you so much for your help. These guys are awesome, and we're very, very indebted to their help. I am going to begin on a fairly solemn note by acknowledging the importance of what we're doing here. Right? You can hear it. You can hear the importance of what we're doing here with bonding, with the metal detectors and everything. We're here to celebrate Constitution Day today, but we also mourn the political assassination that occurred just 1 week ago. Charlie Kirk was a hero to some. He was an opponent to others, but he was also a human being, and he was an American. And as such, he deserved respect, and indeed, he deserved the same respect as every single one of us in this room deserved. But, unfortunately, an assassin's bullet stripped him of his life and removed our ability to exercise our First Amendment rights to debate and to discuss with him. That bullet, of course, also left children without a father and a wife without her husband. What bothers me about this on a personal level is this was not just a political assassination. This was an attack on civil discourse itself. And in the face of this tragedy, I hope we all work to improve our own discourse. As Governor Cox of Utah recently stated, history will dictate if this is a turning point for our country, but every single one of us gets to choose right now if this is a turning point for us. And I think that's a strong message. So we here in this room this evening, we are the captains who will carry on the great American tradition of debate and discourse and discussion. We are the acolytes of those who gave us the First Amendment and the respect that it imparts on individuals. I can't speak for everybody on how you will respond to what we witnessed 1 week ago, but as for me, I choose civil discourse and the First Amendment, and I hope that all of you choose the same. Now, here at the IGC, we aim to become the nation's premier policy institute in creating effective citizens and responsible leaders. We do so by advancing constitutional liberty, economic liberty, conscience liberty, and education liberty. We do that through bold research, transformative teaching, and yes, even fearless debate and discussion. So in the spirit of that debate and discussion, I invite you to our future upcoming events as well. I'm not going to list all of them because we've got a lot going on, but a few that you should be aware of. October 1st, we have invited Andrew O'Shaughnessy from the University of Virginia to talk about Thomas Jefferson and his views on the university. On October 2nd, at the law school, we, along with the First Amendment Law Clinic, will be sponsoring a discussion on free speech on the docket, free speech courses at the United States, free speech cases at the United States Supreme Court upcoming this term. It will be a fantastic event with litigators, attorneys, academics, professors, and the like, so keep that on your agenda. October 24th, we'll have two events, The Founders in Religion and Creating the Constitution. What did those things mean, and what do they mean today? On November 4th, we're working once again with YAF to host Daniel DiMartino, who will discuss how socialism destroyed Venezuela. And on November 18th, we will have Glenn Lowry visiting on campus. Glenn will talk about the case for Black American patriotism. Now, if that wasn't enough, we're also hosting a lot of fantastic events for America's 250th. Students, stay tuned. We're going to have a bunch of movies that we'll host here at the Student Theater and up at the IMAX that are sort of a celebration of America. We're going to do a lot of really cool things coming up, so stay tuned for that. All right? Now, on to our speaker. Rich Lowry is the editor-in-chief of National Review. He is the author of Lincoln Unbound and The Case for Nationalism, How It Made Us Powerful, United, and Free. Rich began his career as a research assistant for Charles Krauthammer. In 1997, he was selected by William F. Buckley to lead National Review, and it remains one of the most influential journals of our time today. Now, Rich will speak for approximately 20 minutes on the Constitution and the meaning of America. When he concludes, he will take questions from you all. Okay? You will observe some of our students. Katie O'Ryan here is going to walk around with this mic, and she's going to allow you to ask Rich a question. Please make sure that your question is civil, and make sure that your question is short, so that others have time to ask questions. Okay? I also need to warn everyone before we begin about FSU's policies. Of course, they do not tolerate disturbances, disruptions, or attempts to shut down the speaker. Attempts to do so will lead to your removal. We have not seen such things at FSU, and I ask you to keep up that great tradition of civil discourse and debate here. I'm proud of FSU students, and do us proud. I welcome everybody here. Thank you for being here. And folks, please welcome Rich Lowry.
Security protocols. We have a lot of security in the room, officers in the room, and outside. And I think even I haven't laid eyes on a little guy myself somewhere, very cute, but I'm sure very talented, bomb dog. So before we do anything else, let's thank the folks here for keep everyone safe. All right, I also want to thank IGC, FSU, the Americans Foundation for sponsoring this event. This is part of my ongoing college tour of colleges that have upset top 10 ranked football teams. So, right after this, it's straight to Texas A&M, but no Alabama or Notre Dame on the schedule. Let me assure you. So, I'm a conservative. I'm not a huge Trump guy, but I support a lot of what he's doing. I think he's done a lot of good things. But then you have this just terrible backdrop of what's just happened. Reagan used to tell a joke about the Soviet premier Leonid Brezhnev, and Reagan would say that Brezhnev was asked, Mr. Premier, how would you summarize the state of the Soviet economy in one word? And Brezhnev said, good. And then the interviewer asked, how would you summarize it in more than one word? Not good. So I kind of think that's how, for folks on the right, that's how we should think about our politics at the moment. And if you'll indulge me for a few thoughts about Charlie before I hit into the substance of my Constitution Day remarks, it was really extraordinary how he overcame all these obstacles that were put in the way of conservative voices on campus. A lot of places, hard for conservatives to get hired on faculty. Conservative speakers not invited. If they are invited, they're disinvited, they're canceled, they're protested. Some cases physically assailed. And Charlie showed that you could not just overcome that, but you could actually win the argument. And with Charlie, 10 years or more ago, it started the same way it ended. It started with a guy in a t-shirt, going to campuses, willing to engage, stir up controversy, good controversy, a debate. And it ended with a guy in a t-shirt, much more famous, much more influential, at campus, willing to debate. And I think what happened is fruition of a deep illiberalism on the left. William F. Buckley, the founder of my magazine, used to say, liberals are very committed to tolerating other points of view, but then always end up shocked and appalled that there actually are other points of view. And we saw the kind of tacit fruition of that. Charlie overcame all these illiberal obstacles to conservatives on campus until there was the ultimate illiberal instrument, an assassin's bullet striking him dead in the midst of a debate. And I think there are many layers to that event. One, I think, that has a lot of maybe resonance that people people aren't even aware of. There was a tiered quad there at Utah Valley. So kind of, people are standing there. It was kind of like a hillside. And that's such a deep thing in Western culture. That goes back to ancient Athens. In Athens, they literally sat and talked, stood on a hillside, and debated how they were going to govern themselves. So this was a violation against us as Americans, also us as Westerners, and in some respect also as human beings. And it galls me that the guy who's supposed to be the hater, Charlie Kirk, showed up only with a microphone and a willingness to engage anyone. And the guy who's supposedly supporting the advanced tolerant views shows up with a rifle and an escape plan. But I've been heartened by the reaction to this. It has struck so deep, right? Moments of silence, Yankee Stadium, and all sorts of NFL stadiums. I think a lot of respectful commentary from folks, even on the left, about Charlie. Now, and what he did, there's been a lot of garbage as well. People on the left saying, the killer was a right-winger. There's no evidence of that whatsoever, and that would have made no sense. Some people on the right saying, Israel might have assassinated him. These people remind me of the old joke. A guy dies, goes to heaven, God says, you can ask me any question you want, I'll clarify it for you. The guy says, so God, who really killed Kennedy? God says, it was Oswald. I said, oh my gosh, I never knew the conspiracy went that high. That's how some people consider our public affairs at the moment. So I'm going to talk about the Constitution. Great British jurist William Gladstone called it the most wonderful instrument ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. And I think that's very apt. So you can talk about this all day, all sorts of facets you can focus on. I want to talk about the deep cultural roots of the Constitution. I want to talk about one relatively neglected national purpose behind it, and talk a little bit about the kind of politics it's meant to create. And then I'll conclude. I'm happy to take any questions about any topic whatsoever. So if you look at America's civil religion, as Tocqueville called it, there's really a holy trinity. There's a Declaration, there's the flag, and there's the Constitution. And no one does these the way we do. Just look at the flag. There's no other country in the world that is as flag-soaked as America. We have a holiday devoted to the flag. We have a national anthem that's all about the flags. We have students all over America starting the day, putting their hand over their heart, pledging allegiance to what? To the flag. We have written into our laws, into our statutes, how the flag is supposed to be treated. And the law says it is to be treated as a living thing, right? Who else does this? No one else does this. And by the way, does anyone know what the rule says about what you're supposed to do with the flag when it's too tattered to display anymore? Does anyone know? What's that? Maybe. I don't think so. Burn it. You're supposed to burn the flag. And I have a colleague who is in a neighborhood where everyone displays the flag, and he was looking a little pale and worn, and he looked up what he's supposed to do with it. He's like, really? I'm supposed to go in my driveway and burn this thing? And, the Daily Beast is going to run a story, senior national review writer burns flag in driveway. But fortunately, this is a problem. There's so many flags displayed in this community that the police take it upon themselves. They'll take your flag and properly burn it. But we think and feel the same way about the Constitution. There's a real reverence for the Constitution. You look at our political debate, it always happens, no matter what. One side's out of power, the other side's in power. The side that's out of power accuses the side in power of being would-be tyrants and violating the Constitution. That's just the idiom of our politics. Now, you might agree or disagree with either of those sides, but I think it's a very healthy thing as a country that we have that reflex. And George Washington said the Constitution should be sacredly obligatory upon all. Sacred. It's a very telling word. So the Constitution is not just a governing document in our civil religion. It's a covenant, which is a word with rich meaning in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So that gets to my first point. Rather than just an abstract set of rules, the Constitution itself is a cultural expression of deep cultural foundations. Our founders, our institutions have these deep cultural roots that we don't always appreciate. Otto von Bismarck, the great Prussian statesman, said the greatest fact in modern history was that North America was settled by English-speaking people. I think he was right about that. He also said that God looks after drunks, fools in the United States of America. I also think he's right about that. But let's go to the English-speaking people. Consider James Madison, founder of the Constitution. Where else around the world do you find a James Madison? Is there one in Spain? Was one in Spain? Was one in Russia? No. Now, it doesn't mean that there weren't very talented, weren't very talented people all over the world. The Russian, you might take Potemkin, right? We all know the phrase Potemkin village, named after this great Russian statesman. Potemkin village was a myth. There were no such thing as Potemkin village. This was fake news created by the British that undermined his imperial project. Potemkin was a genius, right? Probably a better administrator than James Madison. James Madison did let the White House get burned down when he was president, after all. But was Potemkin devoted to Republican government? No. It was all about serving the Tsar or the Tsarina, and he reaped benefits for this. He traveled with an orchestra. He traveled with a movable English garden. When he stopped someplace, they plant the garden, for days, so they admire it, and they dig it up and take it. So there are a lot of benefits to serving as our arena. But none of this is liberal. None of this is about republicanism. None of this is about constitutional government. So you get Madison in our cultural soil. Now, obviously, I'm a big believer in the deep, long, lingering effects of national identity. The late comedian Bob Newhart once said the fact that he's was three-quarters Irish, and one-quarter German made him a very meticulous drunk. And I think there's something about that. So what is our soil? There's a wonderful book came out maybe 10 or 15 years ago called The Weirdest People in the World. Now, weird is an acronym. It means stands for westernized, industrialized, educated, rich, democratic, so on. This book was written by a sociologist at Stanford, I believe, named Joseph Heinrich. And he had this great insight that in psychological studies, they're very often administered to college students in the West. As college students, you're a psychology professor, 400 kids in the classroom, you can easily administer a questionnaire to get to some psychological point you want to make, or you can easily recruit them for your experiment. But what happened is, psychologists and social scientists were using this extremely small subset of people, right? No offense to all the students, college students are not normal, right? They're not the norm even in the United States of America, right? Only, I think, about 40% of people get a 4-year college degree. They're certainly not representative of everyone in the world, but social scientists looked at these psychological examples and said, this is human nature. We've established what human nature is. It is human nature to believe, for instance, that it's wrong if you have access to government money and a government contract to give it to your relatives. Whereas actually, you go to other places in the world like Asia, it's considered wrong if you have access to government money and a government contract not to give it to your relatives. So we misput it ourselves and thought that something that was uniquely Western was really representative of the entire world. And the point he makes is that if you look at these deeply Western attitudes about marital relations, about social trust, and you look at the outer bounds of the Carolingian Empire, roughly in the 10th century, inside those lines, that's where the very most Western attitudes are. Now, they've spread since then, but this accounts for, we're all familiar with the cliche, the south of the country is totally different than the north. And this is something that people say, particularly about Italy. When you look at Italy, in the northern part of Italy, Christianized relatively early on, gets the sexual and family mores of Christianity, and northern Italy is just like anywhere else in Europe. Southern Italy, Christianized much later, a lot of cousin marriage lingers on, you don't get the social trust, you get tribalism, you get amoral familialism, everyone's caring about their own family and not extending the same consideration to others. So there's this unique Western culture, and the most Western parts of this Western culture are Holland, England, and the United States. So it's the English-speaking world that's the key thing. And let me develop this point further. take something that we consider a fundamentally American idea, an idea that the American Revolution was all about, for instance, no taxation without representation. Where does that idea come from? Well, to answer that question, the first thing you need to realize is that England is a barbarian society. And I don't mean this in a cutting or cruel way. I'm an Anglophile myself. I think it's great that we have a special relationship with Britain. Basically, there have been no hostilities since the Battle of New Orleans between two of us, although sometimes there's some acts that could be considered hostilities. For instance, we sent them Meghan Markle, but then there was they sent her right back. But the Romans controlled Britain. Then the Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire, begins to crumble. Emperor Honorius writes a famous letter to the Brits, you're on your own, we can't defend you anymore. And Romano Britain disappears under a wave of invasions. You get the Anglo-Saxons, you get the Vikings, you get the Normans. Normans are just Vikings who've been in Normandy for a while, Norman, Northmen. And the great constitutional settlement in Britain, the Glorious Revolution, comes about via another invasion from the Netherlands. So you have these Germanic people moving into England, and one of the key attributes of this Germanic people is the king governs in consultation with a council. Now, over time, this builds into what becomes a proto-parliament. Some people think as early as the 920s under King Athelstan. And the first no that you get from one of these British councils to a king who's asking for revenue, for taxes from the council, was in 1197. Do you know what other key inflection points in self-government happened around the world in 1197? None. Absolutely none. So when we vindicated this concept of no taxation without representation, it had already been building for about 500 years. And to simplify terribly, what happens is the British, these practices develop, the British write them down in Magna Carta, and then we write them down in the better, I would say, we write them down better, in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And if you've never been to the National Archives, I urge you to go and see in the foyer there originals of these documents, side by side, the Great Charter, Magna Carta, the Declaration, the Constitution. It will stun you. It will take your breath away. And we say now today, I'm writing someone, when actually what you're doing, you're texting them, on your digital device, and they're getting on another digital device. These things are written, right? You could, if you could touch them, you could feel the ink, the ridges of the ink on these documents. They're just amazing. They're under glass there, like ice cream at an urban drugstore. But they're amazing to see. And it's my second point. It's important to realize, it's often neglected, that one of the purposes of the Constitution was to foster our national strength. Because you tend to think, well, we got the Declaration in 1776, and then in 1787 we get the Constitution, everything's great. In between those two things, there was a failed government, a failed United States government. The founders feared was going to discredit the entire project. Under the Articles of Confederation, we had the government couldn't control its borders, it couldn't pay its creditors, couldn't make its own trade policy. Probably a little bit like what the second Biden term would have been. It's not a Constitution Day without at least partisan gathered to. But the idea was we needed a Constitution to forge national unity that would prevent us from fracturing like Europe and allow us to resist European meddling. So this was in part about power and geopolitics, right? And this was a time when European powers didn't have to come over an ocean to threaten us. They were already here. You had the British to the north, you had the French and the Spanish to the south. I guess I should say, actually, get my geography right. The Spanish were here. they were right here. And immediately after the Constitution, when we have a national government worthy of the name, we begin to push back and expel these other countries. So this is where you get this incredible geopolitical lesson that's made us what we are today, that we're a continental nation with a friendly, but sometimes annoying, country to the north that we may or may not want to annex one day, and we have a friendly but poorly governed country to the south. And in terms of geopolitics, in terms of what you have in Europe and other places, that is an unbelievable blessing. So we're not a continental nation that happens to to have a constitution. We are a continental nation because of the Constitution. And then finally, what kind of politics did the Constitution want to create? So obviously, it's all about dispersing, not all about, I shouldn't say that. It has a huge element of dispersing power, right? You get the vertical division between the federal government and the states, each of which have their own legitimate powers and prerogatives, and are going to rub against each other and compete against each other. Then you have this horizontal division among the branches of government, Congress, the executive branch, the judiciary. Again, they're going to compete with each other, rub against each other like tectonic plates in our government. And then you have a list of things that government cannot do, right? These rights that are protected in the Bill of Rights. So what the Constitution really says is that people can be trusted to govern themselves, but not trusted too much. What Madison said is that first you need to enable the government to control the governed, and then you need to oblige the government to control itself. So this is a system that is built for compromise and negotiation. And I don't mean kind of the weak-minded conventional wisdom you hear on the Sunday shows all the time. Can't we get along and be more bipartisan? No, the founders' view is that conflict is a never. It's a never. But this is the way we control it and have it work out. Again, as Madison said, as long as the reason of man continues to be fallible and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As my friend and sometimes colleague Yuval Levin, a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, has put it, the Constitution is built for peace, but not for quiet. For peace, but not for quiet. So very often our system, it's hard to do things, right? If you want to pass a law through Congress, you need to make the case for it, you argue it out, you need to go into committee hearings, you need to write up the bill, you need to clear all sorts of procedural delays and battles and have floor debates. So it takes a lot of motivation and or consensus to get something done. Otherwise, you're not going to get it done. And that's a feature, not a bug of our system. You don't get it done, what do you have to do? You got to go back, make the case to the people again, elect more representatives who agree with you, convince people on the other side, or maybe take half of both. So the sociologist, 20th century sociologist Daniel Bell said politics is haggling or it is force, right? So our system is built for haggling. Ugly, sometimes frustrating, annoying, but much better than force. And force used to be, throughout all of human history, most of human history, force is how things are done. And again, if you look at medieval England, say the Plantagenets, they're fighting each other all the time. They're not just fighting the French, they're fighting each other. The sons are revolting at the kings. The wives of the kings are revolting against the kings. It is constant armed conflict. And as Yuval Levin has written in a book about the Constitution, quote, "We've forgotten that the only real alternative to a politics of bargaining and accommodation in a vast and diverse society is a politics of violent hostility." That's pretty on the nose, right, given what happened last week. And, importantly, this document, this system, has improved through the test of time. It has worked. The Constitution itself now has this long lineage. There was a late writer and thinker named, a political scientist named Walter Burns, used to tell the story of going to a conference on constitutionalism and constitutions. I think it was somewhere in Brazil, and Burns was supposed to give the keynote address. And someone got up, a Brazilian got up and said, "Why is the American giving the keynote address when they've only had one constitution and we've had 20, right? Who knows more about constitutions?" But that's the point. We have had only one because it is such a work of genius, and we have been so devoted to it. And final point before I conclude, I just want to say that this is a great and good country, and we should be overwhelmed with such a feeling of gratitude for all that's been given to us, completely undeservedly, right? If you look at Western civilization, what did any of us do to deserve the beauty and the wonder created by the likes of Beethoven or Paine or Dickens. Just in terms of our system, what did any of us do to establish parliamentary supremacy in England centuries ago, or write the Declaration, or hash out the Constitution? None of us were there in Philadelphia in 1787. None of us were there on the beaches of Normandy in 1944. None of us were there in Selma in 1963. But our lives are enriched in all sorts of ways. We think about it, we can imagine, and some we don't even, can't even think about, by all those centuries of effort, by patriots and thinkers and warriors. It's a little bit like God's grace. It's a gift that you don't deserve. So I would just say we need to realize what we have. We need to hold it together and not tear ourselves down and tear ourselves apart. I think more than ever, the famous passage from the Lyceum Address that Abraham Lincoln gave in the 1830s when he was a young lawyer is apt to our moment. Lincoln said, even then, relatively young country, first half of the 19th century, he said you could take the greatest general that's ever been known to man at that time, Napoleon Bonaparte, you could give him the biggest army the man's ever known, and that army could not take a step on the Blue Ridge Mountains or a sip from the Mississippi River by force of arms. We're too far away, too hard to conquer, too strong even then. But then he goes on to say, if destruction be our lot, we ourselves must be his author and finisher. And as a nation of free men, we either must live through all time or die by suicide. And ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you, especially in light of current events, that we must resolve to live. Thank you very much.
If you have questions, raise your hand, and Katie will make her way over to you.
Been a subscriber to National News since I was 15, so love reading your publication. In the Constitutional Convention with Hamilton and Madison writing most of the Federalist Papers, they seemed to be on the same team. And then over time, it seems like Hamilton stood by it, but Madison seemed to kind of drift away, and I have some insight on my thoughts on that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what was it that caused Madison for them to be on the same page, but then they became big rivals and two-party system and all that. But what do you think it was that caused Madison to drift away from they were on the same team?
Thomas Jefferson's malign influence, I'd say, on Madison. I'm a Hamiltonian, but obviously it goes to, elements of the Constitution are open to interpretation, right? Even among the people who are directly there. I'll just make a couple of points. I don't have a great answer for that, but I'll make a couple of points. These people were not friends, right? The Jeffersonian Republicans thought the Federalists were tools of Britain who were dead set on creating a monarchy in the United States. And the Federalists thought the Jeffersonian Republicans were tools of France who were determined to create a French Revolution and a Bonapartist dictatorship in the United States. These are the founders, right? This is happening in the 1790s. So people shouldn't be shocked that we have real stark divisions in this country and really profound and emotional arguments. That's the way it's been forever. But again, the Constitution is the framework through which you work it out. And I just think Hamilton had the vision of what is modern America. And we're a commercial republic, strong overseas. I don't think he would support how big the federal government has gotten, the central government has gotten, but an industrialized world power, I think, was a better vision than that was ultimately animating Thomas Jefferson. I went to the University of Virginia, so I have a lot of regard for Thomas Jefferson. But an agrarian republic was not going to work. And you look at Abraham Lincoln, people tend to think of Lincoln as a rustic character. He's the rail splitter. If you look at Lincoln's upbringing, totally backwards areas of the country, no commerce whatsoever, no education whatsoever, no transportation whatsoever. When his father wanted to take goods to the market, he'd float down in a raft to New Orleans and sometimes walk or Illinois. That wasn't going to work. So what does Lincoln do? The first thing he does is go somewhere else, go to an urban area and become a lawyer. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone has to do that. And a lawyer for the railroads to connect the country and create a commercial republic that's going to be richer, that's going to have more opportunities for individual advancement, and that's going to be more powerful. So we could have, I'm sure we could have, you obviously have views on this, we could have a big discussion about it. But I think Hamilton ultimately wins that argument regardless of what reason Madison was on the other side.
Thank you so much for that terrific talk. So you started with religious language and you ended with religious language. Do you think that we can have a democratic revival without a religious revival?
No, probably not. A religious revival in some form. Certainly the preservation of certain virtues individually and as citizens that I think ultimately have a religious basis. And one reason the founders were comfortable with not having established religion is they assumed we didn't need one, right? The one book that everyone had then was the King James Bible. Everyone knew the King James Bible. Was anyone, a politician that gave a speech, references to the King James Bible were all over. You read the Gettysburg Address. It's so rich, it's so amazing. It's so many of those phrases that go back to the King James Bible. Even if people didn't know literally the quote themselves, they could feel it, right? Because we're a Bible-soaked people. Now, we've lost a lot of that, but I think there's an aspect in which our system is a product of both the Enlightenment and this religiosity, and they work together. So the French Enlightenment, Voltaire and others, thought the priests are all backwards, it's superstition, they have to be crushed. Not maybe Voltaire literally, but he represented that tendency. Certainly the French Revolution believed that. The American Revolution, the Enlightenment and the religion worked in tandem. The Protestant preachers, folk preachers out there at the time of the Revolution were saying exactly the same thing as a thinker from the English, Scottish, or American Enlightenment thought. And I think that's still true in the United States today. But we're slipping in this regard, and we see it with again, not to refer back to the horrible event at Utah Valley last week. We saw a young man who was acculturated into dark things. Right? He was a nice kid from a nice family. No childhood abuse that we're aware of, no mental illness that we're aware of, but he was sucked in to this online world that is a function of vice and darkness and malice, and that's deeply disturbing. And there's no way we survive over the long term without some deep reservoir of virtue in the country.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm a longtime listener of the editors, and one of the things that I've noticed, many of your colleagues are often quite critical of Congress and its kind of perceived abdication of its role and its authority. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit in terms of your perspective and also what you think, if you do agree with that criticism, what you think the proper solution would be.
Yes, it's a great question. So going back to Madison, I think one of the things naturally most shocked by, these branches of the government are supposed to be jealous of their power and prerogatives, and do too much to spread their power, and then the other branch has to push back. Congress has institutionally advocated for decades. So we don't have just a problem with an overweening executive, and Trump's an expression of that, but everyone prior to him was also an expression of that. Every president was an expression of that. We have a Congress that won't stand up for its own rights and prerogatives. And I was struck by this. I think it was the rent moratorium. It's something that was a lawless executive action. And Chuck Schumer was applauding it. Here's Chuck Schumer, who spent decades of his adult life climbing to the top rungs of the legislative branch. Everything about him is a as a legislature, as a congressman, as a senator, applauding, the executive taking things that he should be doing, right? You have members of Congress now that don't bother to introduce legislation. They go and lobby people in the White House to try to get the president to do it by executive order. So that is just, that I think is the most fundamental threat to the basic constitutional mechanism that Congress won't stand up for itself. And it's very simple. It just needs to develop institutional self-respect again. But I'm not sure when that's going to happen because, again, when your own president of your own party is in power, it's great. It all just happens, by the stroke of a pen, and then you're just waiting for your president to get in there, and you don't have to take any responsibility. You don't have to do this whole process that I just, outlined, debate, mark up the bill, sign on the bill. So if something goes wrong, you're blamed. No, it's other guy. It's this great chief executive. So it's profoundly disturbing.
Hi, forgive me if this isn't a fairly simple question, but speaking about the rise of religion in politics, do you feel that
The rise of what?
going to this question about like the intertwining of like Christianity and Christian revival in politics?
Yeah.
Obviously, we are a Christian nation founded on Christian ideals, but do you feel as though nationalism, specifically Christian nationalism, could threaten our Constitution? And I'm asking that as a Christian, who I think that we tend to believe, and you'll see this in more of like the British historical sense, that authority to govern comes from God. And I feel though is that we become less critical of the person governing if we attribute their governance as a, I'm thinking of the word, but
As God's will.
as God's will in that sense. So do you see that as a harmful thing? Because we know that we were a Christian nation, but there was some attention for a separation of church and state, as written by Thomas Jefferson in his letter to the church.
Yeah, so I just think what the Constitution prohibits is an establishment of a state religion, right? And we're so far from being anywhere like that. I think we have much more public religiosity without getting anywhere close to that constitutional line. And the question of God's will is a complicated one, but it's not meant to mean God willed this to happen, and you can't question it, and you take no active role, and whatever happens, you need to accept. That's fatalism, it's defeatism, it's profoundly against the religious ethic that this country was founded on, which is all about activity, including bettering yourself. So the very most religious thinkers in our founding era, Jonathan Nadler or whoever, never would have thought, a politician's above reproach, you can't question him. So I do think there's a tribalism, which is a different phenomenon, where it's just, he's on my side, I don't agree with everything, but I'm not going to say any criticisms, because if I criticize my own person, I'm giving the other side aid and comfort, so just whatever this person says is right. That's profoundly un-American. I don't think it's healthy for a country, but I don't think that is an expression of Christianity. In fact, as we get less religious, people get more invested in this kind of religious sense of secular politics.
So in light of the events of last week and Pam Bondi's recent comments about hate speech, some might think that we're going to be testing the limits of the First Amendment. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on people's response, celebration of the events. Do especially public figures, teachers, educators, those sorts of things, have a limit to what they can say in those regards? Should they face consequences, or is that protected free speech?
Yes, so this is a hugely important question. So you're a private actor, private institution. The First Amendment is not really involved, right? I think the culture of free speech is. And my strong reflex, if someone says something stupid, they can be exposed, they can be criticized, that's all free speech. But if they apologize, it's sincere, let's move on, let's not try to destroy them. This is not a free speech realm. I'm a big baseball fan. But you probably also, even if you're not a baseball fan, the incident at the Philadelphia ballpark where the father gets son, Karen comes over, yells at him, and gives the ball back. And people are online, let's find her, let's destroy her. You know, maybe she's a terrible person, maybe she's having a bad moment, whatever. She doesn't deserve to be ruined personally over that. And I have sort of the same feeling about the dumb things people say. But if you're, you know, a company, let's say you're Cracker Barrel, and you have a certain kind of audience that's very important to your customer base, and you're a senior vice president of corporate relations, I'm glad Charlie Kirk is dead. Charlie Kirk is dead. What do? You know, if it's going to harm your business, that person, you're fully within your rights to fire that person, and maybe it's totally legitimate and the right call to fire that person. Teachers, you know, it seems as you'd hope like the one class of people would be really responsible about this would be teachers. Apparently they're the worst, but teachers have a real public responsibility, right? Imparting wisdom, setting an example for kids. So I think that's also a legitimate line to draw. You know, a dean of students at a university says, you know, I'm glad Charlie Kirk is dead, I can't wait until the next one is shot. Shouldn't be the dean of students at a university anymore. This is an event that happened at a university. But and finally, on Pam Bondi, she's just flatly wrong. It was shocking. The Attorney General in the United States used to have some passing familiarity with the Constitution. There is no such legal category as hate speech. So-called hate speech is protected under the Constitution. There are a few very specific categories of unprotected speech. I can't libel you. I can't incite someone to attack you. Incitement is very specific. I gotta say, go hurt him right now and have someone act on it, not just say something that's dumb or hateful. So she's trying to walk it back a little bit. But that was really discouraging. Because for the last 10 years, she also said that you can't, if you're an employee or a company and someone comes to you wanting a service related to Charlie Kirk, you know, something printed or whatever, you can't refuse. Yes, you can. And these are arguments that hate speech is protected, that you have a right to refuse the service if you disagree with it. Like, conservatives have been arguing this for 10 or 15 years, with every fiber of our being making this case. And then you have the Attorney General of the United States, as soon as it's inconvenient to her side, turning her back on that.
Hi. Madison wrote extensively about the tyranny of the majority in the newspapers. And here recently, in the last decade, political scientists have noticed this idea of the tyranny of the minority, where minority parties in Congress have a lot of power. And my question to you is, do you subscribe to the theory of tyranny of minority, and are there mechanisms you support to temper the power of minority parties in Congress?
No, I think it's really important to have that check. Now, Congress does a lot of things, even with the Senate having a filibuster rule. When you have a consensus, there are a number of things under Biden that I opposed and didn't think that should pass. It passed with bipartisan majorities. The CHIPS Act being one of them. But the filibuster, people tend to say, you know, this is a modern connivance. It's not. The Senate has always operated in this manner, broadly conceived. There's always been a right to kind of endless debate in the Senate. I think it's an important check. I think it stops really bad things from happening. It's inconvenient to the party in power, but it's not as if we're rendered ungovernable by it. It's not as though if you have a crisis, things aren't going to happen. Congress acts very often when there's a crisis. Look at what it did after September 11th. Look at what it did after the financial crisis. So this can be annoying. It can make things difficult to do. But again, going back to our remarks, the system is built to make it difficult to do things. So you have to wait. So you have to build a bigger and better case for it.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks so much for your remarks. Sorry about that. I have a question, if it comes back on. You talked about, the virtues of our constitutional system and how we're, in some respects, we have some moonlighting. We have some, we're a nation. One of the reasons the Federalist Papers is sort of an underread passage at the beginning of Federalist 2 that the system works is that we have a lot in common, right? We have the shared political principles, shared religious backgrounds, right? These sorts of things. So if if the Constitution is best, that tool for compromise is most effective when you have people who have some things in common. In a time now when we have a lot less in common, what are some of the things that we need to overcome in order to make that tool more useful? And one, I have a question, maybe a pitch for you. I've been doing a lot of reading lately of one of the luminaries of your publication, James Burnham, on the ideology of liberalism. Sort of has its kind of chokehold on the way we think about public life. That might be a limiting factor on bringing us back together as a nation. I wanted to see if you had any thoughts on that.
So it certainly was hugely important that we had spoke the same language. Probably there's some exceptions that I think 80% of people that come from Britain. There's this kind of cultural preconditions I talked about that were widely shared in America, and that was a really important force for cultural cohesion. And it's harder today, but I still think this country has a vast capacity to assimilate people. And they're assimilated differently and put in different things now. But I think what I was talking about, with the civil religion, I think that we're doing a pretty good job passing that on to people who weren't born here, or grandparents weren't here, and there's still a deep attachment to them. Now there are really deep cultural and political disagreements, but that's not new. So just the fact that we have them doesn't make me despair. In terms of is liberalism an obstacle to cultural cohesion? I think it can be in a certain respect, but I think the Constitution, for instance, to come back to our topic, represents both. It's a cultural artifact to which we have a small C conservative attachment. It's who we are. It's been here forever. We're going to preserve it. At the same time, it's a liberal document. So in America, we can both be a liberal in the best sense of that term, a classical liberal, and at the same time, a traditionalist, because I think this is our tradition. And again, if we're doing our job, and we're doing it okay now, we can do it better. People who weren't born here, whose fathers didn't fight in our wars, can feel that electric cord of memory that connects us all, as Lincoln said. But we need to work on it, and it takes constant effort.
Thank you.
That's why we need the IGC and similar institutions and trying to bring it all the way around.
Is indeed why we need the IGC. Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. I love this university. You are great. If you want to learn more about the IGC, you can visit our website at igc.fsu.edu. I hope you all have a fantastic evening. Thanks for coming. I hope to see you soon. Take care.